Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Behavior, Evolution, and Culture speaker series. I'm Clark Barrett. I'm organizing this series this year. We meet every Monday during the academic year, and this week and next week we will also have two additional special talks, which I'll mention in a second. As you know, we have a website, bec.ucla.edu. If you go there, you can see an archive of our past talks, links to the YouTube channel, as well as on the Get Involved tab, you can sign up or unsign up for our listserv by sending your email to the address there. As I mentioned, we have a lot going on this week and next week. We're nearing the end of the academic year, and we actually have two talks this week and two talks next week. I'll announce Augustine's talk in just a second, but I want to remind everyone that this Thursday, we have a co-sponsored talk that Beck is co-sponsoring with American Indian Studies, the Institute for Society and Genetics, and the Culture, Power, and Social Change group in Anthropology. And that is Professor Kim Tallbear, the University of Alberta, will be speaking to us on Indigenous Science and Technology Studies, Governance, and Decolonization. So please join us for that. That's going to start at 12:15 on Thursday, this Thursday the 13th. And I forwarded the announcement, and you can find the Zoom link in there. It's actually a different Zoom link than the normal Beck one, so check that out in the email. Okay, and then Monday, the 17th, we have UCLA's own Isabel Laumer, who will be talking about physical and social cognition in a parrot and ape model species. And next week, it turns out, is Animal Cognition Week, because on Wednesday, we have Chris Crupenye, who will be talking about the social minds of humans and other apes. So that's on Wednesday, May 19th at noon to 1:30. So lots going on. I think that most of these talks will be recorded. I actually don't know about Kim's talk. Please come to that live if you're able to do so. Today, it is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Agustín Fuentes from the Department of Anthropology at Princeton. I want to thank Agustín especially for being so involved in Beck activities this year. As you might know, he served on the panel discussion that we had a couple weeks ago on issues of representation in biological anthropology, and I thought that both of the panels that day were just really, really great, really informative, really great discussion. So I want to thank Agustín for joining us for that, as well as the student diversity, equity, and inclusion group in biological anthropology that organized it. I thought it was a great success. So thanks to you all for that. Today, Agustín's going to be talking to us about his work on the human capacity for belief. His talk is called Meaning Making, Belief, and World Shaping as Core Processes in the Human Niche. Agustín, go ahead and share your slides. And if anyone would like to unmute yourself for a moment, let's please join me in welcoming Professor Agustín Fuentes.
Well, thank you very much. And I'll share my slides in a moment. Thanks, Clark, for the invite, and thanks everyone for showing up to listen to this conversation. I will do my best to keep this to 35 minutes or maybe 40 max, because it's Zoom, it's a lot to ask of anyone. But I do want to, before I get started, to emphasize something that Clark said, and that is, if you have any possibility at all of seeing Professor Kim Tallbear's talk next, I highly encourage you to do it. Professor Tallbear is an incredible scholar who has, I think, very important things to say and very important things to listen to right now. So I strongly encourage you to check that out if you can.
Agreed.
All right, so let us just jump right in here. And if anyone, if I cut out at all or you can't hear me, just wave your arms or yell so I can, but I assume everyone can hear fairly well right now.
Yep.
Okay, great. So we're going to talk about human evolution today, but we're going to talk about it and hopefully have a good discussion after my brief presentation here. We're going to talk about it in a context and in a frame that maybe many of you are not as familiar with, or one that's not as typical, right? So here I'm titling this Meaning Making, Belief, and World Shaping as Core Processes in the Human Niche. And we're going to sort of end up sort of with much more contemporary context, but I want to spend a lot of time in the Pleistocene because I think we undervalue what we potentially know about the Pleistocene and how we might sort of think of that, not just in the sense of cognitive evolution, but the sort of larger picture of the patterns and processes of human evolution. Let's start with a frame, and here I acknowledge Mauricio Anton for his incredible art. Let us remember that when we're talking about human evolution, particularly the genus Homo across the Pleistocene, we are talking about particular contexts that are radically different from what we're seeing today, right? The sheer number of humans, the kind of technological, infrastructural, and ecological processes and patterns that humans find themselves in today are not totally detached from the past, but that past is very different from the present. And so one of our challenges here is how can we think about a past so different, so strange to us, that our contemporary lenses create potential incredible bias. So how do we engage with that? I want to come back to this at the end, but let us remember what we're talking about. All right, so a lot of people have done incredible work talking about arguing for and laying out scenarios for different patterns and processes of evolution of the genus Homo across the Pleistocene. There's a lot of sort of discourse around sort of the general hominins transition to the genus Homo, that is from an afarensis-like or one of the cluster of Australopithecines in the sort of 3 to 4 million year time period. And then between 2 and 3 million years ago, we see the emergence of organisms, of fossils that we're definitely going to classify as genus Homo. In the last 2 million years, we see this sort of diversification of the genus Homo into a variety of different populations. We can come back to the fight about what we call these populations later, but we've got this spread of populations increasingly moving across the planet. So the hominin to Homo hypotheses range from the sort of tools, meat, brain, cognition, the male-male competition, home base, concealed ovulation, a variety of those. And then there's a bunch of Homo-specific arguments that sort of say, okay, well, we did get genus Homo for a variety of reasons, but within the sort of early genus Homo, there's a social brain, or there's fire, or there's predation avoidance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. My point here is that many, but not all, a majority of these hypotheses and arguments and discourses surrounding the evolution of the genus Homo in the Pleistocene, you argue for kind of surgically precise action by selection, optimizing particular traits or processes. I think there's great insight to be gained from this approach, but I think sometimes it misses the forest for the trees. And so what I'd like to suggest is a forest-based approach here to thinking about the human niche. Because human evolution, if you really dig down into the paleoanthropological, paleoarchaeological, ancient genomic, and other data streams, it's not linear. It's morphologically and behaviorally very diverse. There's a lot of very interesting population dynamic variation, maybe in patterns that don't make sense to us right now, thinking about primates in general or thinking about contemporary humans, and that there are clearly multiple evolutionary processes, right, operating at multiple levels simultaneously, impacting these populations of the genus Homo across the Pleistocene. So human evolution is incredibly messy, but I think we can both ask very precise trait-based questions and also step back and try to construct these larger narratives. And I think, or my punchline will be, that if we take this larger narrative in a particular context, thinking through the human niche, meaning-making, belief, and related socio-cognitive patterns become central in our understanding and our capacity to model human evolutionary processes. All right, so also another thing, a little bit more baseline, humans are primates, but lots of times when we talk about human evolution, we forget that, or we just say, well, humans are like chimpanzees, or humans are like capuchins, or humans are like something. That's not what we should be drawing from this primate comparisons, because genus Homo, the hominins in general, are actually very unlike many other primates. But let us acknowledge first the similarities. We are primates, right? We're part of the this adaptive lineage. Primates themselves are much more complex, socially and dynamically engaged in this sort of kinds of social driving factors of evolutionary potentials and cognitive complexities than many people give them credit for. And I like just to remind everyone that as primates, we are already really socially and cognitively complex branch of mammals. And so the starting baseline, right, that we begin with really, and we have to consider this when we talk about human evolution, is this sort of broader emergence from the Miocene hominoids. And I think if everyone's noticed, there's a recent paper, I think just out last week, arguing that it really looks like these sort of later Miocene hominoids that gave rise to the potential lineages that gave rise to hominins probably were very unlike living hominins, particularly the African group, the humans, chimpanzees and gorillas. So we've got a lot of diversity out there. We've got this major transition. We've got another major transition of the African hominines, right? The gorilla, pan, and all of the hominins. And finally, this sort of distinction, this distinctive group, the hominins. So our baseline, before we even talk about the genus Homo and sort of human evolution, our baseline is some form of community, sort of complex social organization, highly social groups with complex social relationships and networks that cut across biological kinship with relatively high levels of cooperation. That is characteristic of all of the African cluster, and one could argue many of even the Catarrhine primates. But let us just stick with the African hominines. We have increased social cognition relative to other primates in sort of this cluster of pan, gorilla, and Homo. And we have some shared intentionality and equity aversion. We can debate those patterns if you want. There's also frequent social reciprocity, local social tradition and innovation, a kind of generalized culture, and simple stone tool use. Okay, these are baseline. We don't need to explain these as having emerged in the genus Homo. This is shared across a much older heritage. And I would argue there's a pretty strong role for social niche construction. But again, we can come back and debate that later. So that's their baseline. But as Darwin and Wallace pointed out quite some time ago, look, evolution is about these continuities, but also the discontinuities. And in this case, in really thinking with and about human evolution, it is the discontinuities, particularly in the genus Homo, that are striking and that I want to focus on here, right? So I think it's pretty non-contentious to say that over the last 2 million years, members of the genus Homo, humans, right, underwent significant changes in brains, bodies, and behavior, creating a new niche, right? Not a unique niche, right? As Darwin pointed out, differences are in degree, not of kind, but a niche, a distinctive way of being in the world that catalyzes and facilitates and adds affordances and constraints of particular patterns that we need to understand if we're really thinking about modeling human evolution effectively. All right, so the challenge of human evolution then has long been sort of figuring out how all these fossils relate to one another. What do these morphological patterns tell us? What does the archaeological information tell us? But I would like to say that the challenge of human evolution is even more than that. It's not just about these sort of pattern change across time in these different populations. It's also, at another level of inquiry, the challenge to come up with understandings that let us explain how a group of small, right, hairless, fangless, clawless organisms, ape-like bipedal organisms with some rocks and stones, went from being able to create these incredible, right, these are Oldowan stone tools, these incredible stone tools, to shaping the imaginary in new ways through art and representation, to reshaping the entire ecosystem of the planet Earth. Right? That's actually also part of the challenge of understanding human evolution. And I'm not making an argument for human exceptionalism. We're not the best thing or the worst thing. We are a particular thing, and understanding the particularities of this lineage, the distinctive processes and patterns that give rise to this, because nothing else has given rise to this. That's important. One area where most people don't engage in this sort of human evolutionary story is the idea or the concept that creativity and imagination are central, right, to human experience. And here I use the artist Guido Danieli's art. These are actually photographs of hands painted. And I show you these from, these are not paintings, they are hands being photographed, because we are able to create, to imagine, and to make those imaginings real in ways that we don't really see in other organisms. And I would like to suggest that right, in that capacity, in this ability, is a central part of our models, or should be a central part of our models of evolutionary processes in the genus Homo. All right, so what are we dealing with? What data do we have? How can we think with this in this mode that I'm urging you to consider? Well, first off, we have a lot of fossils, and I think a lot of people who talk about sort of theoretically about human evolution don't spend enough time actually reading the paleoanthropological literature to get an idea of what's going on. It's an incredibly dynamic time. I taught human evolution this term, and it was wonderful, but also a nightmare because every week there was a new find, which made me redo my syllabus on the fly. And that, you know, there were some common patterns, but there was a lot going on. And really the last couple decades have been really monumental in shifting the narratives and the understandings and recognizing that the human evolutionary process, just at the fossil and paleoarchaeological level, is a lot more complex and a lot more messy, a lot messier than we thought. So we have these clusters of Pleistocene fossils that we lump into the genus Homo. And these form the basis of our data, right? So we talk a lot about these fossils, about morphological comparisons and patterns. We try to understand sort of neurobiological processes and masticatory, right, foraging and dietary adaptations. And we try to understand sort of maybe potentially environmental influences, structures, selection on particular cranial and postcranial structures. We also are able to create sort of narratives of sequential evolutionary processes. That's so we can tie these morphotypes, right, to place and to time. And so we can get some idea of that spread over time. And that's really important because that sets a baseline, that template for our models. But I also want to point out something that most people haven't been talking about, and that is that from the get-go, here are the 5 famous crania from the Dmanisi site. About 1.8 million years ago. From very early on, the genus Homo is characterized by pretty substantial morphological variation, morphological diversity, and as you'll see, also by behavioral and material diversity. So rather than a sort of this traditional painting of, well, there was just the Oldowan and then there was the Acheulean, this sort of reduced notion of diversity, we have to ask, what do the data actually reflect? And in fact, you will see that morphological diversity and probably behavioral diversity are from the get-go, part and parcel of the Pleistocene niche for the genus Homo. Now, depending on how you slice genus Homo at any given time, it's going to look very different what these relationships. And here's sort of from Scary et al. In 2018, just an argument for, look, depending on which time we're looking at Pleistocene Homo, we're going to see very, very different sort of relationships between populations and structures and patterns, connectivities and disconnects. And that becomes really important. And here's sort of a tongue-in-cheek slide from John Hawkes. And this has been borne out increasingly by the paleo DNA, the ancient DNA studies. Members of the genus Homo, at least for the terminal Pleistocene, the last 400,000 or 500,000 years, spent a lot of time defying our species concept boundaries and demonstrating that population dynamism, interactivities, and patterns are a lot more complex than we thought. All right, so we don't just have the fossils, right, or some of these ancient DNA samples that we can excavate, but we also have this incredible material record, right, with sort of 3 general phases early on of stone tools, the Lomekwian, the Oldowan, the Acheulean. The Lomekwian is associated with pre-Homo hominins, right? It's a very gross sort of tool technology, but it is still a tool technology, and it is quite interesting. But then we get the Oldowan, and then the Acheulean associated with genus Homo. And what we see is a kind of ratcheting up of complexity. But let's walk through that and think about that for a moment. It is important to point out that the differences between the Lomekwian, the early Oldowan, later Oldowan, early Acheulean, and later Acheulean, and sort of tool use by, say, Capuchins or stone use by Capuchins or other organisms, I mean, there are distinct patterns and structures that relate to differential types of complexity in their sort of production and use. And I think that's very important that we see a ratcheting up of complexity, right? And a wide spread of variation within these different types that I think is very important. So what am I talking about? Well, it turns out that when we think about a stone tool, and when I show this to students, you know, and they're never impressed, it's a sharp rock, but you should be impressed, right? Everyone should be incredibly impressed. Aside pre-Oldowan, there was nothing that mapped to this. Even just the idea of the acquisition and transport of materials, the development of the learning and production methods, the kind of replicability that we see evidenced in the samples, and the innovation associated with this creation. So we know from, you know, substantial study a lot about what it took to make even these what are called simple Oldowan-Stone tools. But it's not the making that I'm most interested in by itself. It's not the end product of the tool. Rather, it's what the tools did and what the tools meant. I would like to suggest that it's the concept of a tool as a critical part of the sort of social, ecological, behavioral lives of members of the genus Homo across the Pleistocene that gives us some insight, because it is not just about sort of making tools and using the tools to sort of, extract foraging goals or targets or to chase things off, but it also, extremely importantly, about the transmission of knowledge, about the handing off both within the generation and across generations, the instruction, the facilitation, the apprenticeships, however you want to model this, the transmission of information in ways that we don't see, right, at a level of intensity and specificity and technological outcome in other organisms. And I think this is really important. Now, as we sort of move through the Pleistocene, as this is an old story and everyone's already talked about this, but it's very important to note that as sort of we move into the Acheulean and more sort of serially complex stone tools, we see the demands, the cognitive demands, but importantly, the social demands, the creative, innovative, and learning, teaching demands of these tools become ramped up, ratcheted up dramatically. And there's pretty good evidence, and I do follow Dietrich Stout and others' work in this, suggesting that these increasingly complex, socially learned, transmitted tool use patterns, these cultures, structures of tool use, reflect new ways of restructuring, embodying sort of social evidence. So neurobiological processes and changes are part of these feedback loops. Now, it's not just sort of this sort of anatomical, morphological, and population level diversity. It's not just this sort of technological sort of increasing ratcheting complexity and its cognitive impacts. There's also robust evidence that fairly early in the genus Homo's evolution, particularly by the mid-Pleistocene or so, we have an incredibly complex cooperative parenting system, a kind of shared investment in young that has clear correlates that we can see in contemporary humans and that we can see in the archaeological record of increased investment, sweeping changes to both neurocognitive and endocrine systems, and that create social structures facilitating extended childhood periods, which means that most of our brain growth and neurobiological development occurs outside the womb in social contexts with intensive learning, socially mediated landscapes and worlds. So this cooperative reading patterns, we can debate about some of the details, but we can see those psychoneuroendocrine systems evident in contemporary humans, and we can see this as setting a critical stage for understanding the human niche. So we've got this morphological and populational, morphological diversity, populational dynamism. We've got this technological ratcheting and complexity, and we've got this incredible sort of extended childhood, cooperative, collaborative parenting structures facilitating kind of feedback loops that can radically change how sort of knowledge and practice is embodied. So really over the Pleistocene, if you spend some time looking, particularly by the terminal Pleistocene, the last 300, 400, 500,000 years, what we see is a new niche, right? A new way of thinking with. And the work of Rick Potts and Alison Brooks and their very large teams clearly demonstrated, oligocyle, this incredible example of increased foraging targets and foraging diversity, of long distance transport or trade or exchange of materials, of the sort of starting to use sort of non-clearly functional in the sense of foraging target material items, and dynamic and probably multiple sorts of relationships between groups in populations and across populations on the landscape. So really, by the last 300, 400, 500,000 years, we're seeing really the human niche, not in its contemporary form, but as it's set up to facilitate all of these sort of different dynamics, the morphological, populational, technological, social, cultural, and developmental processes feeding back, co-shaping one another. And I just want to point out a really good work by Doug and Becky Bird and others, pointing out that when we talk about small scale groups, we shouldn't just think of them as simplistic egalitarian clusters. They are complex hierarchies, they have complex histories and patterns and relationships, and there's pretty good evidence that these sort of deeply complex, socially dynamic, structured groups have a deep history in the genus Homo. All right, so where are we? What do we know about humanity? We know a lot of things that by the late Pleistocene, we have a substantial expansion in brain size and neurological plasticity. We've got incredible cultural innovation and manipulation of extrasomatic materials. We've got cultural complexity, cumulative culture or ratcheting. We've got unbelievable levels of cooperation relative to many other organisms. And we've got an interdependence between ecological, cognitive, and neural systems and skill transmission. We've got the language-ready brain, whether or not we have language, that's a debate or a fight that we can have later. And then we have really a socio-cognitive niche and a ubiquitous semiotic ecosystem that is distinct from other organisms. And in the last 10,000 years or so, we've got the sort of Holocene and Anthropocene explosions. And we have a good idea of sort of how these things have patterned out, right? The run there. I think recently Kevin Leyland and Amanda C. did a nice job of arguing, again, echoing Darwin, that this is not something totally different in kind from other organisms, but it's this cognitive layering, this skill transmission, this knowledge transmission, this sort of multi-generational teaching and learning all piled on one another that facilitates a kind of really interesting cognitive processes. The only thing I would complain about this is I would not say cognitive uniqueness, I would say cognitive distinction and really distinctive human niche. So by the last quarter of the Pleistocene, we have a human niche, right? That has all of these things that I've just outlined. This human niche produces something really interesting at around this time. Evidence, material evidence of meaning making, right? 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 years ago, we see the famous Jourdans et al. Carved clamshell, or carved, or, a doodle on a clamshell. But around the same time, we also see increasing use of ochres, right? That is excavation, manipulation, scarring of ochres. In the last couple 100,000 years, we start to see sort of Blombo style hex marks on ochres, ostrich egg cells. We see snail shells, Nassarius snail shells being perforated and used. And then in the last 100,000 years, we see art. Again, if you can't see it here, this is the great Sulawesi example of some of the oldest, very old cave art. And then in the last 50,000, 60,000 years, we start to see sort of figurines and carvings and things like that. The environment humans make for themselves is created through their symbol using ability, their capacity for abstraction. The symbols, the ideas are created in the mind, but the human animal learns not only to create them, but to project them onto the external world and there transform them into reality. Here, Ashley Montagu said this, 50 years ago, and I think it is more relevant now than ever. This process, this capacity to look at the world, to see what is out there, to imagine something relatively or wholly new, and to try to make that a reality, I think is a part and parcel that emerges, part and parcel of the human niche that emerges with force over the course of the Pleistocene. There is a ubiquitous semiotic ecosystem, as Terry Deacon notes, and a distinctive human sociocognitive niche. And to understand human evolution, we need to engage with that. So here we are, mid to late Pleistocene, hominin morphological variation, right? But at the same time, this variation is not just morphological. These populational dynamics are not just about movement of individuals or populations over landscapes. They're also a reflection of a dynamic process of the development and deployment of meaning making as part of the human niche, alongside technological innovation, alongside increased and more complex foraging strategies, alongside increased transport or exchange of items across distances, alongside more complex inter-group relationships. Mark Kissel and I, not that long ago, just took a look at the literature and asked the question of all these things that could be, and here I'm intentionally not using the word symbol. We can sort of discuss this later, but I have a problem with using symbol, and Mark Kissel and I have written about this. We looked to the published archaeological records paleoarchaeological records and ask, where are things that could represent meaning making, that are clearly sort of constructed items that meant something to those that constructed them? And it turns out that over the last 400,000 or 500,000 years, there's a lot out there, and it gets more and more dense and more common, right, over this time period. So as we move towards the end of the Pleistocene into the more contemporary moments. And these characteristics range from, doodles on clamshells to sort of dubious, who knows what they are, but maybe modified by humans, to clear ochre uses, to even clearer sort of systemic processes with ochres, to things like Venus figurines and the Lion Man figurine. I'd like to suggest that this meaning-making capacity, as part of all of these other processes, right, an emergent component of that, facilitates the possibility of belief in human evolution. Belief defined as an ability to combine histories and experience with imagination, to think beyond the here and now, to see, to feel, and know an idea that is not immediately present to the senses, and then to wholly invest in making that idea one's reality. And so this is the turn that most folks talking about human evolution don't take. But I think it's a very important one, because really over the last part of the Pleistocene, we see more experimentation, ramping up of complexity, more sort of diversity of movement, of behavior, of technologies across the landscape of the genus Homo, including more populations going extinct, disappearing, spreading out. And I would argue that this capacity for belief, this capacity for melding experience, imaginations, histories, cues from the world, and imaginary creative possibilities, and committing wholly to them with a kind of hope or even faith, facilitates the kind of investments that resulted in the contemporary possibilities of humanity, the contemporary niche and landscapes. So let me just point out one side thing and then get back to sort of wrapping this up. I would like to suggest that part of this capacity for belief, and this is related to what many of you do here, is thinking with this cognition. I would like to suggest that as most organisms have very good cued representational abilities, right? A cued representation or a cued mental state. I can show you this picture of an apple. You can feel that apple. You can hear the crunch. You can taste it. This is common across all sorts of organisms, and organisms use this in constructing memory and navigating, negotiating their life. But I would like to suggest that the human capacity, this cognitive capacity for imagination, creativity, and innovation, enables us to have a kind of detached representation. So rather than an apple, when I'm sitting on a train, I could be looking out the window and come up with something like this. I've never seen anything like this. I don't know any flying octopi eating apples or whatever. But the capacity to imagine, the capacity to create, and to commit to those creations so that they become a reality, a perceived reality for the individual, for the group, for the population, I think is extremely powerful. And I think there's very good evidence from neurosciences and from the entire sort of psychoneuroendocrine processes in humans, that humans on board, that we literally embody in extremely important ways, concepts, perceptions, beliefs, in ways that they structure the physiological and organismal functioning so that they structure our perception, thus would be central, or at least a component, of evolutionarily relevant behavior, actions, and decision-making. I think the work by Greg Downey and Daniel Lendy in neuroanthropology does a nice job of outlining this. That basically the idea that neuroanatomy, human neuroanatomy, all neuroanatomy for organisms, but for humans, memory, maturation, and trauma become part of our bodies. Cultural concepts and meanings become our anatomy because they structure the way in which we see, perceive, smell, taste, and experience the world, and thus become evolutionarily relevant in the process. So human evolution obviously involves sort of the basic genetic and physiological and neurobiological morphological patterns. This is the baseline. This is the basal biological data we have to work with. Human evolution, of course, involves that biological basal processes and patterns, but incredibly important are the diversity of ecological systems, structures, and contexts in which humans find themselves. So it's the interplay, the traditional interplay between ecosystems, ecologies, social and material, and the sort of genomic, neurobiological, physiological, morphological contexts. But what I like to add and suggest and I think with robust support, that it is also the perceptions, beliefs, and commitments that humans have that structure in interplay with our ecologies and our biologies, how the human niche is shaped, what kind of processes are functioning, and in the end, form part of the evolutionarily relevant processes and patterns that we have to consider. So here's my punchline, and then just a couple more points. Diversity and complexity, from bodies to behavior to social structures and intergroup relations, characterizes the genus Homo across the Pleistocene. Feedback systems between behavior ecologies, cognitive and bodily systems via learning, teaching, and communicating are absolutely central to the successful nature of the human niche. So creativity and cooperation imagination give rise in this context then to meaning making, right? And meaning making, imagination, communication, creativity in social community and ecologies facilitate belief. I'm not saying belief is more important than genes, right? Or particular behavior patterns or selection for particular structural things, right? I happen to believe, right, the structure of the human arch in the foot is extremely important to human evolution. But I would like to suggest that sometimes we need to also model these broader cognitive structural niche-based processes in addition to the more tight trait-based focuses. Here I invoke to end Jonathan Marks' quote, "While it may be attractively pseudoscientific to imagine human evolution as simply biological history, driven by simple biological processes, the most fundamental aspect of human evolution belie that assumption." They are not. Human evolution is not about biological features with biological histories, but biocultural features with biocultural histories. From the get-go, from pre-genus Homo, but particularly for genus Homo. And so very importantly, and here's what I want to end with, who tells those histories and how are they told? So if it's biocultural histories that we're really interested in understanding the sort of complexity of human evolution, who gets to tell those histories? And I think a look at the history of human evolutionary science tells us there's a problem. And that problem is that biases in our understandings of the past and our evolutionary processes lead to flawed reconstruction of human evolutionary history, promote misconceptions about human behavior and human societies. I would like to argue a particular dominance of male-based, white, Eurocentric engagement with the diversity and understanding, and I'm not knocking a lot of these contributions, but I am saying that our understanding of the possibilities and patterns of human evolution have been constrained because of a lack of diversity in those practicing, in those actually doing the research and constructing the questions and the answers, telling the narratives of human evolutionary processes. So diversity is not simply about social justice and opportunity, although it serves both of those ends. Diversity here in the scientific endeavor is about building the best possible programs, doing the best research, and training the best students. And I would like to suggest that human evolutionary studies, right, really, of the many areas we need to work on, engaging a more diverse, collaborative, intellectually generous landscape offers us a better potential for more effective answers. Diverse experiences, views, and perspectives, and an intellectual fearlessness and an intellectual generosity, I think, are necessary if we truly seek to understand the human niche in the Anthropocene. There are lots of valuable methods, lots of ways to ask questions and assess things, multiple levels of inquiry, but we've got to be open to a much broader landscape and perspective if we're really interested in getting at the most interesting parts of human evolution. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thanks, Augustine, for a great, really thought-provoking talk. And I want to second the thought that you voiced at the end there about the importance of different perspectives and broadening our perspective as researchers in understanding human evolution. I think that's a really important message. And I thank you for saying it. Let's open the floor up to discussion. We've got plenty of time. Just as a reminder to people, the easiest thing to do is under the participants bar, the raise hand option, the so-called blue hand. Raise your hand or otherwise wave at me, and I will put you on the list. Who would like to go first? Erica.
Hi. Thanks, Augustine. Really exciting talk. So I have a bunch of questions, but I will narrow it down to one, or maybe 1.5. So I was really interested in, as you put it, the sort of turn that not a lot of biological anthropologists take of thinking about the sort of, genus Homo commitment to imaginative creation so that they become a reality. And I thought that that was really very interesting. And I wanted to know if you could speak a little bit about how that turn might relate to two other things that I think get talked about in the comparative primatology literature and the human evolution literature more broadly. One of those is how does that turn relate to something like future prediction or imagination as short-term projection of possible outcomes of sequences of behavior? Episodic memory, that there's research in AI about imagination as sort of different possible outcomes of a sequence of events. And then the second one is thinking about the role of the evolution of extended childhood as a period of increased flexibility in imagination, and to use Alison Gopnik's exploration exploitation trade-off, thinking about childhood in particular as a locus for that blossoming of imagination.
Yeah, thanks, Eka. Those are great questions. And I think I want to just be really clear that when I'm talking about this sort of imagination, creativity, and innovation, right, I want to really be strongly clear. I am not saying other organisms don't have patterns and processes that relate to that. No, but it's, and I know but there's this sort of, oh, well, it's only humans. It's just, I would argue that there's a particularly distinctive pattern in humans, right? And so, while I would argue there's, especially in, let's just take, a couple of the really highly social mammals, a lot of primates, cetaceans, maybe even the corvids for some birds, others, there's these social organisms that use short-term, and I would argue long-term prediction and experimentation as sort of a very important social structuring and part of their niche. I think there's increasing evidence that that's the case. In the genus Homo, though, I really think that what we're seeing is not just this sort of deployment of these capacities in functional sense. Let's look at there's 3 outcomes or 7, or how can I think myself out of this complex situation? That's the way we usually imagine it. Here's a challenge to get some kind of food, a challenge to get meat, a challenge to get what have you, to live in this water-stressed environment. I would like to suggest that those are all true, but that fairly early on in the genus Homo, particularly by mid-Pleistocene, we're seeing evidence of a capacity not just to use this in these sort of functionally constrained or directed goals, but to have imaginings and innovative experiential modes of perception that then become deployed, not with a particular functional goal that might not even be fitness related, but might be expanding the repertoire, the perceptual or experiential repertoire that downstream might facilitate some of those changes. So I hope that makes a little bit sense, because then that becomes important for your second question, right? I think it's really important to think about childhood both from a very structural and neurobiological sense, this extended childhood, this ridiculously, and I don't want to use the term underdeveloped, I'm just saying in the process of developing brain, right, that we get so much of this sort of neurobiological, really psychoneuroendocrinological buildup connectivity that's post-birth, much more than most other organisms. And I would like to think that exposure, right, what we can actually measure, right, neurobiologically, it's just massive increase in numbers and densities of connections that actually start getting pruned, right, as we get older. That pattern, I think, opens up the window for lots of, not just experimentation, but lots of sensation, perception, and imagination that is relatively little constrained because of this incredibly protected childhood that downstream provides sort of baseline, neurobiological baselines for social, behavioral, and experiential decision-making that facilitates recourse to imagination and to imaginaries and innovation in ways that other organisms might not have as extensive. And here, just this recent paper by Kevin Leyland and Amanda Seed, this idea of just layering, humans layer experience knowledge from multiple others, plus linguistic context, plus sort of these meaning-making, socio-symbolic realities, constantly layering, which facilitates this kind of messiness to the imaginary possibility. And that was a very long answer, but I'm still working through exactly how we model this, because you can model the neurobiological development and pruning, but what becomes very difficult is sort of how do we translate that to what organisms actually do and how might that affect evolutionary trajectories?
Great, thank you. Next, we have a question from Dan Fessler.
Hi, Augustine. Thank
Hey,
you.
Dan.
Really, both stimulating and elegant, I got to say, just aesthetically, very, very elegant. But, it's my job to push a little bit. So let me see if I can push. And I'm not trying to take anything away from the conceptualization and the focus on belief in your formulation. But as your quote from Ashley Montague indicates, there's a certain element of revisiting the past of the field in a way here. So, Irving Hallowell's presidential address in, I don't know, it was 52 or 53 or something like that to the AAA basically was, a call to study the human capacity for culture as the fundamental inflection point in human evolution, right? And then, 25, 30 years go by, and Richard Klein claims there's been this, cognitive revolution where there's this new ability to combine ideas, right? And realistically, as important as those insights have been, they were not generative in terms of helping us to understand, because the paleoarchaeological record obviously is limited in its ability to reconstruct behavior, and even more limited in its ability to reconstruct cognition and affect. So what do we have to study? Well, we have comparative psychology, and we have the psychology of contemporary humans, right? And it really wasn't until, 40 years went by when, people started applying adaptationism to psychology that progress was made. And I'm not saying that everything that evolutionary psychologists have done, since the 1980s is right, but I am saying a lot more progress has been made than after Hallowell or Montague or any of these other calls to study the capacity for culture, the big change, the cognitive revolution, whatever you want to call it, okay? So my question for you then is, where do we go next, okay? Right. Everything that you said could be right, and it doesn't actually tell us what to do unless we adopt the adaptationist gambit and say, okay, let's carve nature at its joints. Let's look at the way the mind is designed, right? Let's have, point predictions about how the mind should operate given our best reconstructions of the past, right? And that, it's not incompatible with anything that you've said, but what you've said doesn't get us there, is my point.
No, Dan, thanks. I think that's really, it's a very good point. And let me just, I'll answer that in the way I think what my answer is, but let me point out first that, this idea of a human revolution is not at all what, because that was actually wrong. Because it's a process over time. I don't think there's a cognitive switch. And I think, no, but it's really important because people can misunderstand. I'm not saying that something happened and then we had this cognition.
I understand.
It's the process that's so incredible. And you're absolutely right. Like almost everything I'm saying is pretty much almost everything most scientists say has already been said in different ways. We just have maybe more data about it now to sort of frame it. So I think that's really important. And I also, the one field that you didn't mention, which I think is very important, is anthropology. Right. And so I think that the sort of engagement in evolutionary sense, ethnographic research is very important. So I think all those things are, and I would agree that a lot of what I do is in fact a form of evolutionary psychology. I have no problem with that at all. I just would contend that a lot of evolutionary psychology is insufficient in the depth into which it goes, but that's another argument. But is this all just sort of, do we have to carve things at the joints, right? Do we have to have an adaptive, sort of very specific trait-based, genomic-based, or what have you, selection model, or an adaptationist sort of narrative to understand this? And I don't think we do. I think those models are important. I think they're critical, and I think they've gotten us a long way. But by themselves, I think they're insufficient. And I would argue that the extended evolutionary synthesis, thinking through niche constructive sort of models and profiles, thinking about evo-devo in particular ways, and these sort of complex dynamic systems approaches might offer us complementary or, you know, different level order discourses around these same kinds of things. And so I'm actually more optimistic that contemporary changes in evolutionary biology, sort of looking at what people are doing across the board, offers us a few more options than just the adaptationist paradigm. But I by no means whatsoever say that the adaptationist paradigm has not been beneficial and is not beneficial. It is, and I think it keeps people structured. I just think there are other means by which we can discuss and propose evolutionary dynamics than just selection, for example. And I would want to really point out that very traditional approaches to human evolution have been overlooked too much. Genetic drift and drift in general of a lot of structural material drift, I think, is showing and really again and again emerging as incredibly important, that a lot of this variation that we're seeing in the Pleistocene, a lot of morphological variation, and I would argue a lot of material variation, might be better explained via drift than some other arguments. And so I would like to say there's many ways in which we can engage this, but I don't want to take anything off the table. I just want to put more things on the table.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. If others have questions, I would encourage you to raise your hand. In the meantime, let me ask a possibly not very well-formed question, Augustine. So, I mean, I think you've really hit on something with this, the idea of belief and meaning making as being central drivers, you know, sort of involved in a causal feedback loop in human evolution. But it got me thinking, and I'm not sure if this is the right way of thinking about it, or whether you would think of it in this way, if, what sorts of sort of pre-adaptations you might have, you know, in the sort of Gould and Lewontin sense that enable the evolution of meaning making. Because it seems like one of the things that you point out as central is this idea that the ability to represent things that are not present directly present in perception. And I wonder, you know, if that sort of thing, like, I guess you might call it like decoupled representation or something like that. Would you think of that? Because I can imagine a species that would have decoupled representations where it's not really meaning making in the beginning, right? So you could imagine an animal that knows that a predator is hiding behind the bush. It doesn't see the predator right now, but it has some representational system that says, you know, that thing went behind the bush. It's probably still there. Even though I can't see it right now, I'm going to continue to attend to this bush. And, you know, could that kind of thing be a sort of pre-adaptation for the evolution of belief as you're thinking of it?
I mean, that's a very deep one because that's common to a ton of organisms.
Yeah.
I think I've never understood why so many people think animals are stupid. I find animals incredibly intelligent, and that cognitive patterns and processes in many other organisms are incredibly complex, and I think they're able of keeping multi-layered, very complex sort of creative contexts. So that's an argument for someplace else. But what I will say is to give you an example, which I think is important. So I talked early on about sort of the Oldowan, the stone tool production, right? And here I really acknowledge Dietrich Stautz's and a lot of other folks' works on this. Making a stone tool, even an Oldowan stone tool, right? Making a stone tool is not just about sort of happenstance, right? There's a sort of a learned, acquired, replicated process, but it also provides the concept that a material object can be altered and restructured in a way that produces a new material object with totally new uses, or relatively new uses. That concept then allows you to look not at a stone, but as a bone shard or at something else, and potentially deploy that. And so my argument is that the genus Homo because of this constellation of events, the feedback between these changing developmental processes, serving increasing material complexity, and this ability of the extended childhood to sort of layer on potential imaginings or neurobiological processes, even if those get shed later, all of this set up the capacity to do more of that, reaching beyond the particular material at hand and taking that concept and reapplying it someplace else. So it's similar to what you said, but I think in the particularities, because early members of the genus Homo became very connected to a particular kind of material manipulation, extrasomatic material manipulation, in ways that are not common with other organisms. And that, with this other feedback and these other kinds of ecological and neurobiological changes, open up the possibility of deploying these conceptual structures to act as perceptual filters when looking at the world, that allowed experimentation in ways that I think continue this ratcheting process.
Wow, that's super interesting. So if I'm getting you right, so I get the point that many people have sort of linked materiality and tool use, but the manipulation of artifacts, or the creation of artifacts, I guess it would be, through the manipulation of natural things, it sort of is a key part of the story. But do you see a link then where, so, beliefs that you're talking about later, things like reality creation. So, I mean, making a stone tool is creating reality, right? But then we also have social construction of reality type of phenomena. Those then would be like maybe the manipulation of objects in the world creatively, like you're saying, then leads to things like religion and so on, and other things.
I would,
later on.
There's many so I would make a closer link between an Oldowan stone tool and an iPhone than I would between an Oldowan stone tool and, Abrahamic traditions, right? Okay. Because I think when we get into religions, and I talk about this in my recent work, this difference between religiousness, this sort of transcendent experience of organisms, and sort of institutionalized, structured. And so I think we have to be very careful when sort of talking about contemporary human institutions, right? And human evolutionary processes. So I think there's multiple stages in there, but yeah, no, I agree. And I think the great, incredible work people have done on the refined details of stone tool technologies are so important. But what I have become interested in, because of looking so much at those material details, is the fact that they provide perceptual and conceptual potential imaginary correlates that then sort of open up the possibility for innovation and creativity for members of the genus Homo. And we see this, and this is what I think this sort of initial attempts at meaning making, doodles, carvings, what have you, ochre use, come off of this core, right? But not so much necessarily as a functional adaptation, right? As part and parcel of this experimental landscape, because the experimentation is facilitated because the human niche offers these affordances without them being deleterious. At least in some cases.
Yeah, no,
I think imagination got a lot of populations sort of in bad shape and they went extinct, but that's a whole nother story.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, and I think I reached for organized religion or religion as an example of social construction, but I actually think there's many more ordinary examples. So just things like conventional social roles that are mutually agreed upon, that require some sort of collective agreement that this person has this position or title, or
well, think about just exactly here.
Group that where it's it's through mutual imagination that we agree what our group is and what the identity of our group is and things like that.
I mean, a good example for that with stone tool technologies would be, why did some populations make tools in this same type of tool this way and others made it a different way, right? That's fodder for exactly what you're talking about. Sort of normative assumptions emerge even in the material record when they're not necessary, right? These are not functionally constrained normativities.
Yep. Great, that's a really cool connection. Let's take a question from, and I want to say hi to, Karthik, UCLA alumnus, Karthik. Welcome back. What's your question?
Thanks, Augustine. That was a great talk. I am really sympathetic with just about everything you said, but I wanted to push you a little bit on your response to Dan's question, because where I've always struggled with a lot of these issues, I don't disagree with anything you said, But for whatever faults a kind of hyper-reductionism that evolutionary psychology or adaptationism offers, that reductionism is easier to test.
Yeah.
So the question is about epistemology more than what the world is like. When you say you want a forest approach rather than the trees, or you want to put more stuff on the table, my concern is then it becomes this mess that can't be tested ever in principle. So that's, I guess, the question that I have.
Thanks. That's actually a great question and a very important one. So when I say more things, when I say a forced approach, what I want to do is create a larger rubric so that we get a multiple levels of questioning within which we get exactly the kind of testing you're talking about. I think we're constraining ourselves to the kinds of actual testable experimentation and investigation that we do, right? I think starting with a constrained approach doesn't encourage the kind of creativity that we need to really get some of the best answers. So I think testable hypotheses have to be, right, a part of all of this. And so I would argue, so for example, some of the work I'm doing now, sort of moving forward or getting ready to put in a large grant on thinking about this concept of concepts, right? How do we measure and test this perceptual, this dynamic assemblage, right? And so we're getting very clearly into specific case studies, both ethnographic and archaeological, where we can say, okay, here's what your big sort of idea is saying. So here's one piece of that. Show me that that piece actually is accessible. So it
would be more simple, wider diversity of simple hypotheses rather than more complex hypotheses, if that makes sense.
So maybe a wider diversity of hypotheses, some simple and some more complex, right? So for example, I think our ability to use very contemporary, I'm just gonna give you an example here, sort of sequencing of ancient genomic material has reshaped the kinds of questions we can ask. And so these higher level populational structures in our hypotheses and sort of theorization about population movements during the terminal Pleistocene has really shifted because of very specific, right, focus work on the ADNA. But that ADNA very specific stuff doesn't work as well without these broader sort of contexts. So I think the two relate to one another. And so, yeah, I'd agree. And I really, the problem, I should also be very clear, the days of single scholars doing a lot of work by themselves are over, right? Everything has to be team-based. You know, these kinds of questions always require large collaborations. We can think, right, and produce and talk about our thinking, but really good questions are solved by complex collaborations at this point.
Great, thank you. Let's take a question from Josh. Hi, Josh.
Hey, how's it going? Very much enjoyed the talk, and as others, I'm very sympathetic to the broad outlines. I guess I wanted to just ask about what specifically you're putting on the table with regard to the notion of symbol, or the notion of symbolic representation that's supposed to be distinctive of the human niche. And I wanted to ask about the commitments you have, if any, regarding meta representation or kind of theory of mind. So specifically, whether you think the notion of symbol that's at work, either, with the emergence of modern humans, or reflected in the kind of art that you mentioned, requires agents to be forming beliefs about other agents' beliefs, or whether there might be other kinds of social cognition that's mediating those kinds of interactions that might involve imagination in some way, right, about the world, but not necessarily imagination about other agents' minds. And so I mean, this is a hotly debated issue about how much kind of that theory of mind is required. But so, I mean, I guess it's just a request for you to elaborate where you stand on that kind of debate about the place of those kinds of meta representations.
Thanks, Josh. That's a great question. And let me first say that I don't have time to go into it here, but Mark Kissel and I have a number of publications, Cambridge Journal of Archaeology, recently in Evolutionary Anthropology, and a couple other places where we push against the use of term symbol for these material items and really invoke a Peircean semiotic approach and use sort of Peirce to sort of talk about meaning making, legisigns, sin signs, and things like that. That's a much longer sort of in the weeds specialist argument, which I'd be glad to go into if we have time, but I think it's really important given your question, what I'm about to say. So I push against symbol because symbols are items that mean something, right, based on shared agreement around those meanings by a particular group or culture. And I don't think we have access to what those potential meanings might have been. We can demonstrate something was created to evoke a sensation or with a particular pattern or pattern of repetition, but we can't say what it might have been. So why is that important? Because I do agree that in many cases, this sort of theory of mind, this attribution of mental states to others might be very important, but I agree, I would like to argue that it is not necessary in many of these cases because we think, so we tie so much into our contemporary sort of notion of mental representations of others that we cut ourselves off to this possibility of different kinds of imaginaries, different kinds of engagement with the world and perceptual and cognitive processes might facilitate other modes of theory of mind that do not sort of focus on the individual, me, other, sort of that kind of connectivity. And I think there's a lot of work out there that is pushing against this. And I think it's really important. And if we look at just the material record, and I would like to remind everyone that sort of this sort of, meaning making, sort of marking on ochre, sort of carvings and etchings and lines, we're talking 200,000-300,000 years old here. It's not just these figurines and paintings. But with the figurines and paintings, it is amazing how long it takes for human faces to show up in the material record. Even representations of humans are slow to get there unless they're sort of animal-human hybrids. And so I would like to suggest that the past, right, is stranger, and again, evoking something that many folks before me have said, the past is stranger than we're aware of. And I think opening ourselves up to other modes of theory of mind, not just this sort of mental state attribution, might be beneficial in thinking through some of these representational possibilities. I don't know if that gets it an answer, but it's really, I would like to say that we are probably selling our ancestors or early members of genus Homo short by constraining them to sort of think with our theory of mind.
You want to follow up on that, Josh?
Yeah, just one quick follow-up. So would you be open, given that, to thinking that some living primates engage in a form of meaning making because of the way in which they do have arbitrary, I mean, they're not iconic systems in the same way, but they're arbitrary or conventional systems of kind of mental representationally mediated forms of behavior. And so they're kind of psychologically mediated by acts of sending and receiving, and they're arbitrary. And so in that sense, they could be meaning making. Is that, or would you be open to that?
No, I would actually argue that not just for some primates, but I would say there's robust evidence in a cluster of cetaceans. And I think that there might be even the case be made, I'm not sure I'm totally convinced, for some corvids. So I think we constrain ourselves by this, and this is why I said this sort of diversity is important in the evolution, sort of evolutionary studies. I think we're constraining ourselves because we're unduly influenced, I'll blame Kant and a number of other scholars for restricting what we think of as the possibilities for theory of mind. I would suggest from the existing literature, there are arguments to be made that would, I think, support the assertions you just suggested.
Great, thanks so much.
Fantastic. Okay, let's take a question from Paulo. Hi, Paulo.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, now we can't.
I think we lost you, Paulo.
We can't hear your audio, but you're not muted.
No, still nothing.
Your mic cut out somehow? If you want to work on it, on checking your mic, that's the other thing. If you'd like to write your question in the chat, you can do that. The other thing is I could take another question and come back to you if you want to work on your mic, because we're not hearing you right now.
Can you hear now?
Oh, very, very faintly, like there's a bad connection. Try it again. No, I think it's your mic cutting out. If you'd like to send me your question in the chat, I can read it. In the meantime, would anyone else like to ask a question?
No, it's a lot of a lot of stuff, but your questions so far have been fantastic in pushing on this, and that's another thing too that's hard in the Zoom landscape, this two-dimensional landscape. A lot of this representationally, I need really dynamic sort of three-dimensional or even four-dimensional models that would help with this in kind of discourse. We haven't got to that point yet. So,
yep. Oh, we have a question from Brian Wood. Hi, Brian.
Hi, Augustine. Thanks for your great talk. I was wondering if you could talk more about the kinds of evidence that we could use from studies of living organisms in naturalistic contexts to make any kind of inferences about the capacity of meaning making. And I want to, selfishly draw your attention to how organisms use space as a possible critical line of evidence, because it could involve literally this idea, as you phrased it, beyond the here and now. So how an organism makes decisions about where to go in a habitat could be potentially revealing about some of the inner representation, or at least something, an area where you could generate potentially testable hypotheses about expectations and patterns, and just leave the floor open to you to perhaps talk about ways to tie in spatial behavior into this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me reference a few non-human organisms, then actually come back and talk about humans, because I think it's an incredibly important range to think about. So a couple of things that have struck me over the years in thinking about use of space is, of course, because of my work and the work of many other folks with non-human primates, sort of social space, right? What does it mean to occupy space and place within a group, right? And the social dynamics of positionality, particularly in three-dimensional landscapes. For me, primate groups are always navigating physical space, social space, sort of experiential space, right? And then sort of contextual space. And I think those are dynamically engaged and part and parcel of the daily life for a primate. So I think there are many organisms, particularly highly social organisms, that really navigate space and different from something like a chemoreceptive landscape of space. So for example, for ants, which is absolutely fascinating, I think for a lot of social mammals, for example, the deployment of social space is a very dynamic, but constantly sort of informative and maybe even predictive, right? Or definitely predictive, but maybe imaginative avenue for thinking with and about what it means to be sort of in that organism's context. So that's one way that I think is very important. And I think there's a lot of, really good recent work on space use in captive and non-captive contexts. So I think that's very important. And we've known about that for a long time. But more interestingly, I think, is the recent ability to tag and track long distance movements in many organisms. I find it absolutely spectacular when we look at some cetacean movement. It's mind-boggling. Or great white sharks, right? Female great white sharks have these incredible pathways and movements across, thousands of miles of open ocean, and they're repeating some of these, and we see this in a lot of cetaceans as well. It's sort of repeat uses across incredible distances that are correlated with social experiences, right? And probably sonic experiences. And so I think the cetacean notion of space is not just the three-dimensional space in which they exist, but I would argue, and I think there's good evidence to support that the sonic space, right, sonic landscape is also really important. And I think that those modalities, right, we don't even think about. And so how does that help us think? The idea of making space into place is a characteristic, sort of central part of the human experience. And if we think of the Pleistocene Homo, when we start to see, for example, long distance exchange, transport, or whatever it is of different materials, we need to think about what did that space, what did that movement across that space, what are the sort of transitions across different sort of ecotypes and structures, how did that reshape the way in which Homo perceived or experienced the world? So yeah, I think there's a lot of really good conceptualizations. And I would argue that it's not just migratory species, but these species that move over incredibly long distances. The thing that just came out a few days ago about these few bobcats they tracked that moved a couple thousand miles, they have no idea why. Wolves, for example, also do these really long distance moves. I think we've undervalued the possibility of, cognitive complexes associated with long distance sort of spatial mapping and how that structures the perceptual realities of these organisms. In contemporary humans, let me suggest too that ethnographic work suggests maybe a lot of us sort of, global North and Western scientists should hang out with folks a little bit more and ask them or think with them about how the world is. Our constraints on our perceptions of how the world is a very functionalist, very coordinate-based, particular kind of context. And it turns out that there are many successful ways to be human, and there are many successful ways to navigate and perceive of space. And I think our particular historical blinders have maybe shut off some of the ways in which humans have been engaging and constructing space and place, and that we aren't deploying in some of these inquiries about human evolution. So that's a long answer, but let me just, I think it's a fascinating thing, and really the cetaceans and the sharks have really blown my mind, and I don't know what's going on, but I find it fascinating.
Cool. All right. Yeah, cetaceans and sharks. Absolutely. Let me read Paulo's question, assuming that your mic is still not working, Paulo. I'll just read the question that you typed in. So he asks, development has a central role in your proposal. Would you go as far as developmental systems theory to question the foundations of evolutionary biology in dealing especially with human evolution? And then he adds, I guess this is related to the controversies around adaptationism.
So here, and people always want to take sides on this. I would like to suggest that that's a misconstruction of the patterns and processes. I think developmental systems theory is an incredibly important a theoretical toolkit. I am a fan of Susan Oyama's work and a fan of a lot of the Evo-Devo that has emerged over the past 3 decades, really, because it actually is extremely important to think, if you're interested, I am very interested in physiological pathways and processes. So developmental structures and the patterns and context of development are central. And I would argue that adaptationism and sort of dynamic or developmental systems theoretical approaches don't have to be exclusionary. They may be targeting or trying to explain different patterns or components of the same processes. And I think that the thing I will say, though, is that I develop a deeper commitment to spending time with the complexities of developmental systems, I think is necessary, because I think we give them short shrift as a central player, a central process in organismal evolutionary trajectories. So I think a lot of folks underplay development because it happens and they sort of try to chop it up and target it. But I think the processes involved in developmental systems are incredibly important. The problem is they're really hard to study and they're incredibly complex. But just to end up, if we think about this radical shift in the extended childhood period of the genus Homo and sort of what that enables developmentally, then we have to recognize that developmental systems processes and a better understanding of the ranges of what these developmental processes look like has to be central in our models and our understandings. I think that, one last thing, don't even get me started on the microbiome and the sort of holobiont approach, which I love, but it terrifies me because how do you model the evolution of the homobiont? Joan Roughgarden and others have put out, Gilbert and others have put out a lot of sort of arguments for this. And I think it's fascinating, but it's pretty clear that multiple species sort of simultaneously co-developing and shaping one another's development are actually, targets of selection in some of these contexts, and that's complicated.
And thank you for the foreshadowing, Augustine, because our last talk of the year will be Alyssa Crittenden from UNLV, who's going to be talking about the microbiome and what she calls microbiomania, which is a word that I love. I also wanted to add, adding to your plug for Evo-Devo, when I first encountered that literature, it was also a revelation. And you were mentioning this sort of like the distinction between adaptation and drift, right? And how drift, we need to think about that more when we think about human evolution. But it also seems to me that one of the values of Evo Devo is that it's yet another way to begin to understand some of the, arbitrary, maybe arbitrary isn't the right word, right? But that there's a historical trajectory that brings us to where we are that you can't really think about necessarily as either drift or adaptation. It's just that there's a starting point that, well, there's no single starting point, right? But that natural selection acts on the sort of materials that are there. And that perspective, Evo Devo really seems to add to the toolkit we have.
Yeah. I mean, this whole idea that what we're really talking about are patterns of constraints and affordances in developmental systems, and then the different points at which there are inflections in those trajectories. And I think that's really important because, yes, some of those are clearly identifiable in adaptive scenarios, others are not. And so we need to figure out how do we model these sort of multiple processes and forces and dynamics across these trajectories, right? So this is why I focused on morphological diversity in the genus Homo in the Pleistocene. Like, we make a big deal about these different populations, right? We're going to call this cluster Neanderthals, or this is Western and Eastern Neanderthals, and here are Denisovans. Well, here's this archaic sapiens, or here's this, or we could call these, we have multiple names for them. We don't have good definitions for species concepts in the Pleistocene, but we're also assuming, right, very discrete and functional coherent assemblages of morphological processes that actually look like sort of ranges of fully, workable developmental trajectories of the genus Homo. And so I think just even shifting how we might be talking about these things is important. Not to knock all of the incredible work that has gone on to sort of discourses about speciation, but I'm much more interested in populational variation and what that might tell us. And so thinking developmentally about some of these patterns, helps us a lot with the quandary of, for example, brow ridges.
Exactly. There's no downside to thinking about development. It has to be part of it. I agree.
Well, the downside is it takes a long time and it's really confusing and sometimes doesn't give you satisfactory answers.
That's right. Yeah. Erica has a question.
Hi again. I also don't want to dominate the discussion. So if anyone else has a question, particularly a student, please jump in, take my spot.
Why don't you go ahead with yours, and then if anybody else wants to jump in the queue, again, I agree. If any students want to ask questions, please.
Absolutely. So I guess a tongue-in-cheek remark was just when you're talking about cetaceans and sharks, and I was like, the aquatic ape is coming back around, but I wanted to sort of reflect on what I thought was a beautiful through line in your talk about the importance of diversity, sort of operating on multiple levels and multiple timescales. And so I wanted to ask whether you saw diversity as an active generative process or more of a foundational substrate for innovation. Is it a choice between different possibilities? Is it about alignable differences during comparison of ideas? Is it, really a productive dialectic of really working through things in opposition? And so I just wanted to see if you could maybe do a little bit of connection between what you were talking about earlier in the presentation about Homo in the late Pleistocene as having dynamic relationships between different groups and that being really important. And then at the end of your talk about diversity within biological anthropology as being very important for innovation and development within the field.
Yeah, there's so much there, but let me give you an example actually that's more boring, and that is morphospace, right? So we think about diversity, when you said diversity could be generative, that's exactly the way I think of it. So if we think about the Pleistocene, cranial morphospace, sort of the range of cranial characteristics and structures that we see in let's say the last 500,000 years in the Pleistocene and genus Homo, what we see is this probably not a ton of constraint on a lot of these sort of micro details and shifts around the cranial morphology, but they all might be sort of deployed in different ways that give them possibilities. So having a lot of variation possible within this morphose space of functional, right, cranial variation might facilitate then the emergence of different trajectories and patterns. So having that variation there, as we all know, that's a basic evolutionary understanding. So in that sense, diversity can be generative. But the second example you give of the social interactions between groups or social dynamics between groups, I think there, the diversity then actually can facilitate novel adaptive, right, and developmental patterns and processes because of interactions with groups. Exchanges can have, population level impacts at genomic and physiological and epidemiological context, but also the transmission, sharing or not sharing of information and how that information is shared, sort of diverse interfaces across different groups, I think is central in giving rise to these notions of identity, to these very critical human cultural evolutionary trajectories that become central, particularly by the end of the Pleistocene, beginning of the Holocene, facilitating the kind of things that we see in the later Holocene and into the Anthropocene. Oh yeah, and then at the end, why do we need diversity in biological anthropology, evolutionary psychology, psychological sciences, philosophy, cognition, what have you? Why do we need diversity? Because if we don't have diverse lived experiences and perspectives, we are cutting off, right, the possibilities of understandings. If we don't, my experience is different from your experience, is different from someone else's experience. And if we all have sort of relatively uniform experiences, or if we train everyone and expect everyone to do the same kind of work and the same kind of thing, we're actually doing something that I think is antithetical to intellectual growth and to more effective scientific inquiry. So I would argue that there are moral, socially just, and economically important reasons for increasing and maintaining diversity in the scientific sort of training and research. But I would also argue that there are methodologically and theoretically necessary reasons for this. So diversity is not just this, catch issue or this thing that is essentially related to social justice. I think it's about better science. I think we have been suffering because of the limited voices doing human evolutionary research.
Thanks. That's such an important point. I totally agree.
Me too. I absolutely think that this is important, and that I think this is also something that the message that you're bringing is I just see it starting to resonate throughout biological anthropology in particular. It's remarkable that the field hasn't noticed this already or done something about it already, but it seems
people are trying. There's a lot of good work out there.
Absolutely, and it seems like a moment when awareness of this issue is increasing, including, I completely agree with you that there's consequences for the way science is done. It's not just an ethical thing, although it is that as well.
Let me also plug the linguistic hegemony of English. Also remember, there's a lot of great work not published in English, done by people outside of North America, Canada, and the UK. And I really encourage people to think about what it means to be in other languages doing human evolutionary research and other experiences in nations and contexts. This is not just about North America or the UK.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a great point. I will pause for a moment to see if there are any more questions. We have time for one more if anyone would like to ask anything else or make a final comment. But we are up at the end of our time slot. So if there are no further questions, I would like to thank you so much, Agustín, for this talk and for the great discussion. So many interesting things and great points, and what a great theoretical perspective you're bringing to the field. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks everyone for the questions. They're fantastic. I really appreciate it. And you have a great group here.
Thanks so much. Thanks. Okay, I'm going to end our recording, and if I can do that. Did I just end the recording?
No.
Hold on. Sorry. There we go.